The Western was once America's cleanest myth. White hats, clear justice, simple violence with simple morals. But by the late 1960s, something changed. Filmmakers stopped looking backward with nostalgia and started staring straight into the blood-soaked truth of the frontier. Tonight, we're looking at the Westerns that crossed the line, the ones so brutal, so bleak, they were considered too violent for their time. Number 15. The Wild Bunch. 1969. Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch didn't just change the Western, it detonated it. Released at the edge of a cultural breaking point, the film redefined screen violence with an intensity audiences had never experienced. Gunfights weren't quick or heroic. They were prolonged massacres shown in slow motion. Bullets tore through flesh. Blood sprayed across dust and stone. Death was chaotic and indiscriminate. The story follows aging outlaws who know their way of life is ending. What makes the violence so disturbing isn't just its graphic nature, but its meaning. Peckinpah forces the audience to sit with every consequence. Innocents die. Children watch and learn. Violence spreads like a disease rather than resolving conflict. When the film entered the 70s broadcast cycle, it was immediately targeted. Television versions removed entire action sequences. International releases were shortened. Some territories banned it outright. The final massacre alone was considered unairable for years. Today, The Wild Bunch is hailed as a masterpiece, but at the time, it was treated like a warning. This was the Western refusing to lie anymore, and that honesty terrified censors. Number 14. Duck You Sucker, 1971. Sergio Leone's Duck You Sucker arrived disguised as an adventure and revealed itself as something far darker. Beneath the humor and spectacle lies a brutal political Western steeped in betrayal, executions, and revolutionary violence. Leone stages death not as triumph, but as tragedy repeated until it loses meaning. The film follows a bandit pulled unwillingly into the Mexican Revolution. As the body count rises, the violence becomes increasingly grim. Mass executions, firing squads, prisoners gunned down in cold blood. Leone lingers on faces, forcing viewers to confront fear and regret rather than spectacle. This approach made broadcasters deeply uncomfortable. Television edits stripped out execution scenes and softened the revolutionary massacres. Some international cuts removed entire subplots tied to political repression. The film's anti-romantic view of revolution clashed with the simplified narratives networks preferred. Duck You Sucker was never meant to be an easy watch. It's a Western about how violence spreads faster than ideals. That message made it dangerous viewing in an era desperate to forget its own unrest. Number 13. The Big Gundown, 1966. The Big Gundown looks like a traditional manhunt Western. In reality, it's a relentless deconstruction of justice itself. What begins as a chase becomes a parade of cruelty, exposing how easily law turns into brutality when unchecked. Lee Van Cleef plays a lawman pursuing a man accused of assault. Along the way, he witnesses torture, lynchings, and sadistic punishments carried out in the name of order. The violence isn't explosive. It's methodical. Public beatings, mock executions, men broken slowly rather than killed quickly. When the film reached American distributors, panic followed. The U.S. release was heavily cut. Character moments that exposed cruelty were removed. Violence was shortened to preserve a sense of moral clarity that the original film deliberately rejected. In its uncut form, The Big Gundown is unsettling because it offers no comfort. It shows how violence hides behind badges and legal language. That was a message 70s audiences weren't supposed to hear. Number 12. Compañeros, 1970. At first glance, Compañeros plays like a lively, revolutionary Western filled with humor, music, and swagger. But beneath its surface, energy lies a deeply cynical portrait of political violence that made it a censorship nightmare. Directed by Sergio Corbucci, the film strips revolution of romance and replaces it with chaos, manipulation, and bloodshed. The story follows a mercenary and a revolutionary forced into uneasy alliance during the Mexican uprising. What begins as opportunistic violence quickly escalates into executions, torture, and mass death. Corbucci frames brutality as routine. Prisoners are beaten publicly. Firing squads operate without hesitation. Ideals collapse the moment power shifts hands. When Compañeros entered television circulation in the 70s, it was heavily altered. Entire execution scenes were removed. Revolutionary violence was shortened or implied rather than shown. The moral ambiguity at the film's core was softened to avoid offending broadcast standards. What made Compañeros dangerous wasn't excess gore, it was perspective. The film suggests violence is contagious, that revolutions don't cleanse society, they inherit its cruelty. In an era still reeling from political unrest, that message was too sharp to leave intact. Number 11. The Great Silence, 1968. Few Westerns were censored as aggressively as The Great Silence, not because of spectacle, but because of despair. Sergio Corbucci delivered a film so bleak, so merciless, that many distributors refused to accept its existence. Set in a frozen wasteland, the film replaces sun-baked heroism with snow-soaked death. Violence is sudden and cruel. Bounty hunters execute the poor for profit. Corpses freeze where they fall. Justice never arrives. Even the hero is silenced permanently. The original ending was considered unacceptable. Audiences were not meant to see evil win so completely. As a result, alternate endings were created for different markets. Some territories banned the film outright. Others rewrote its conclusion to fabricate hope where none existed. Television broadcasts trimmed violent confrontations and softened character deaths, but no edit could fully disguise the film's nihilism. The violence lingers not in action, but in outcome. Every moral structure collapses. The Great Silence terrified censors because it denied resolution. It suggested violence is not corrected by time or law. It simply ends things. That truth was too cold for the era. Number 10. Sabata, 1969. Sabata is often remembered for its style, gadgets, and swagger. But behind its flamboyant exterior lies a surprisingly vicious Western that broadcasters struggled to sanitize. The violence may be playful in tone, but its imagery was deemed unacceptable for family audiences. Executions occur in public. Gunfights erupt suddenly and end brutally. Sabata himself uses concealed weapons that kill in shocking ways. The film treats death as clever rather than solemn, which made it even harder for censors to justify. When Sabata reached television syndication, edits were severe. Gadget killings were shortened. Bodies vanished between cuts. Execution scenes were trimmed to implication. The goal was to preserve charm while erasing consequence. Yet Sabata's violence matters because it reflects the shifting Western archetype. Heroes were no longer righteous lawmen. They were strategists who survived through superior force. That moral shift unsettled networks accustomed to cleaner myths. Sabata wasn't banned, it was quietly altered. And in those missing frames, the true brutality of its world was hidden. Number 9. Django Kill If You Live Shoot, 1967. Django Kill. If You Live Shoot is not a Western designed for comfort. It's a fever dream of cruelty and paranoia that treats violence as something surreal and unavoidable. The film abandons heroism entirely, replacing it with mass death and psychological collapse. From its opening moments, the violence is excessive and unrelenting. Men are lynched in public. Gold lust drives entire communities into bloodshed. Bodies pile up without meaning or redemption. Death is not a climax. It's background noise. What disturbed censors most was tone. The violence is not exciting. It's strange, ritualistic, and often senseless. Scenes linger just long enough to unsettle rather than entertain. When the film entered international circulation, it faced bans, cuts, and title changes. Television versions removed entire massacres and reduced the final act to fragments. In the 70s, this kind of nihilism had no place on broadcast schedules. Django Kill wasn't just violent, it was hostile to traditional storytelling. It suggested the frontier was madness itself. That made it impossible to cleanly censor. The violence wasn't something you could trim. It was the entire point. Number 8. A Bullet for the General, 1966. A Bullet for the General presents revolution as a machine that consumes everyone involved. Rather than glorifying rebellion, the film exposes its inner cruelty through calculated assassinations and systematic violence. The story revolves around political murder disguised as heroism. Executions are strategic, betrayals are inevitable. Violence is carried out not in rage, but with precision. That calm brutality made the film especially troubling to censors. American distributors shortened the film significantly. Political executions were removed or reduced. Character motivations tied to ideology were simplified to avoid controversy. Television edits further softened the violence by cutting reaction shots and aftermaths. But even in altered form, the film's message remains uncomfortable. Violence here is bureaucratic. People die because systems demand it, not because villains deserve it. That perspective made the film dangerous for its time. It asked audiences to question revolutionary myths rather than celebrate them. And in the 70s, that kind of questioning often ended up on the cutting room floor. Number 7. Keoma, 1976. Keoma arrived late in the Western's decline, and it shows. This is a film soaked in death, disease, and decay. Violence is slow, painful, and unavoidable. There is no clean resolution, only survival. The film depicts a town ravaged by plague, ruled by sadistic power. People are executed casually. Others are left to die slowly from illness. Gunfights feel less like action and more like inevitability. Each death pushes the world further into ruin. When Keoma entered television circulation, censors focused on its lingering imagery. Slow deaths were shortened. Plague victims were removed. Scenes emphasizing suffering rather than action were trimmed aggressively. But Keoma's violence isn't shocking because of blood. It's shocking because of hopelessness. The film suggests the frontier is already dead. The violence is just its final echo. That idea made Keoma incompatible with sanitized Western nostalgia. It was too bleak to broadcast intact, and too honest to fully erase. Number 6. Face to Face, 1967. Face to Face is a Western about transformation, and that transformation is driven entirely by violence. What begins as an intellectual exercise in power slowly mutates into something far more disturbing. This is not violence as spectacle. It is violence as education. The film follows a timid professor who becomes fascinated by an outlaw. As he drifts deeper into the criminal world, executions stop being shocking and start becoming instructional. Killings are staged publicly. Authority shifts through bloodshed. Violence is treated as a language you learn to speak fluently. Censors struggled with this premise. Television versions removed execution scenes and shortened confrontations where violence was framed as morally persuasive. Reaction shots that emphasized enjoyment or curiosity were trimmed to preserve a false sense of condemnation. What made Face to Face dangerous was its implication. Violence isn't portrayed as corruption imposed from outside. It's shown as something dormant inside civilized men, waiting for opportunity. That idea was deeply unsettling in an era still clinging to moral binaries. Face to Face doesn't just show violence. It explains how violence seduces. That was a lesson broadcasters were not willing to teach. Number 5. The Shooting, 1966. The Shooting is one of the strangest westerns ever made and one of the most quietly disturbing. Its violence is minimal, but its impact is profound. Death arrives without explanation. Motivation is deliberately withheld. Every gunshot feels like a mistake you cannot undo. The film follows two men escorting a mysterious woman across a hostile landscape. Along the way, people are killed without justification or emotional release. Violence happens suddenly and is never celebrated. It simply removes someone from existence. This refusal to contextualize death unsettled distributors. Some markets pulled the film entirely. Others edited scenes to clarify motivation and soften ambiguity. Television broadcasts treated the film cautiously, minimizing its confrontations to avoid confusion and discomfort. The Shooting terrified censors because it removed meaning from violence. There is no moral framework to fall back on, no reassurance that death serves purpose. In a genre built on justification, this was heresy. Violence without explanation was far more dangerous than violence with blood. Number 4. El Topo, 1970. El Topo isn't just violent, it's confrontational. Alejandro Jodorowsky weaponizes brutality to attack myth, religion, and masculinity all at once. The Western becomes ritual, violence becomes performance, and death becomes symbolic rather than narrative. Executions are graphic and deliberate. Duels are humiliating rather than heroic. Bodies are displayed. Suffering is prolonged. Nothing is framed for comfort. Instead, the audience is challenged to endure. Because of this, El Topo faced bans, heavy censorship, and midnight-only screenings. Television broadcasts were nearly impossible. Scenes involving ritual killings and symbolic violence were removed or obscured in edited versions. What frightened censors most was intent. El Topo does not condemn violence politely. It forces viewers to confront why they expect it to mean something. By stripping violence of narrative reward, the film exposes the audience's complicity. This was never a Western meant for mass acceptance, and that made it one of the most aggressively censored films of its era. Number 3. Johnny Hamlet, 1968. Johnny Hamlet is a Western filtered through tragedy, philosophy, and blood. Adapting Shakespeare's Hamlet into a frontier setting, the film replaces royal courts with graveyards and replaces poisoned goblets with gunfire. The result is a Western where violence feels inevitable rather than dramatic. Killings unfold slowly and deliberately. Duels are stripped of excitement. Revenge is portrayed as psychological rot rather than righteous purpose. Characters die not because they are villains, but because the world demands it. This emotional weight made the violence far more disturbing than its body count suggests. When the film circulated internationally, several territories trimmed duel scenes and shortened violent confrontations. Television broadcasts further muted its intensity by removing reaction shots that emphasize despair and moral collapse. What troubled censors was tone. Johnny Hamlet does not treat violence as release. It treats it as inheritance, something passed down through families and history. The frontier becomes a place where tragedy repeats itself endlessly. In a genre that once promised renewal, Johnny Hamlet offered only decay. That made its violence too heavy to show unaltered. Number 2. The Mercenary, 1968. The Mercenary presents violence as commerce. Every gunshot has a price. Every death is a transaction. Set during the Mexican Revolution, the film strips warfare of ideology and exposes it as business conducted at gunpoint. Executions occur publicly. Betrayals are sudden and lethal. Violence is not framed as chaos but as strategy. That cold efficiency unsettled broadcasters far more than spectacle ever could. American television versions trimmed execution scenes and softened confrontations where violence was clearly profitable. Dialogue emphasizing transactional killing was reduced to preserve the illusion of moral alignment. What makes The Mercenary so unsettling is its honesty. Violence here isn't emotional, it's professional. People die because contracts are fulfilled. That portrayal shattered the comforting lie that violence is always driven by passion or justice. For censors, this was unacceptable. The film suggested violence wasn't a failure of morality, it was a system, and systems are harder to condemn. Number 1. Cutthroats 9, 1972. Cutthroats. 9 sits at the extreme edge of Western brutality. This is not a revisionist film. It is an endurance test. Violence is constant, intimate, and cruel. Death is slow. Pain is prolonged. Survival feels accidental. The film follows a group of prisoners and soldiers trapped together in frozen wilderness. What unfolds is a descent into savagery. Characters are stabbed, mutilated, and executed without hesitation. There is no hero, only victims who haven't fallen yet. The film faced immediate censorship. Several countries banned it outright. Others demanded heavy cuts. Television airings were nearly non-existent. The violence wasn't just graphic. It was relentless. There was no narrative relief. What terrified censors was intent. Cutthroats. 9 doesn't use violence to critique myth. It annihilates it. The frontier is not harsh. It is predatory. Civilization collapses the moment restraint disappears. This was the Western stripped to its ugliest truth. And for many, that truth was too much to show. By the time the 70s tried to tame these films, it was already too late. The Western had changed forever. Violence could no longer be hidden behind heroism or law. These movies exposed the cost, and no amount of editing could put the myth back together again.